Hello and welcome to this episode of Weir Wednesdays, where we take a deeper look at artworks in the Weir collection. My name is Deborah Antonsik and I'm the Director-Curator at RiverBrink Art Museum. Today we're looking at this watercolor, Indian Barn, Friendly Cove by Emily Carr. It's the only work by Carr in the collection, a collection that has relatively few artworks by women artists. There are more than 500 different artists represented in the collection, but only 36 are women. It's important to reflect on this absence of the voices and perspectives and creative talents missing from our historical and contemporary collections, appropriately as we reach the end of March, where we celebrate Women's History Month. At RiverBrink, we have acquired additional works in recent years, adding work by Alicia Killaley and Gita Kaiserman-Roth and Daphne Ojig, but much more needs to be done. The watercolor Indian Barn Friendly Cove was purchased by RiverBrink founder Sam Weir from Eaton's Fine Art Galleries in Toronto in 1953. It was offered for sale by Max Stern of the Dominion Galleries in Montreal, who acquired it directly from the artist. It's a large watercolor showing a small Christian cemetery indicated by the white crosses beside a building, a fairly large structure within an encroaching forest in a deep woods in the background. Emily Carr was a key figure in Canadian art in the 20th century. Today, she is one of the best known Canadian artists and highly regarded. But this was not always the case. She lived in poverty for much of her life, scrounging materials and supplies, and even abandoning art making for several years. Carr was born in British Columbia in 1871 to a middle-class family in the expatriate British community in Victoria. When Carr was a teenager, both of her parents died within 2 years of each other, and Carr was left in the care of an older sister. Here we're looking at a photo of the family home built by Carr's father in 1863. It suffered alterations and even a fire at one point, and then extensive restoration. It is now the Emily Carr Center, the Emily Carr Art Center in Victoria. Carr escaped to study at the California School of Design in San Francisco in 1890, with reduced financial circumstances after the death of her father. She returned home after 3 years and began teaching art classes. This established a pattern for the future, stints of teaching to earn enough money and then travel to other places. Carr traveled to London, England to study at the Westminster School of Art in 1899 and visited Paris, where she may have encountered Impressionism and Post-Impressionism at this time. Carr also studied at the Artist Colony in St. Ives in Cornwall, but ill health forced Carr into a sanatorium for 18 months before she returned to Canada in 1904. Carr went back to teaching art in Vancouver and opened an art school for children, but felt the sting of her lack of success. In 1910 to 11, Carr was back in Europe, studying and painting outside Paris in Brittany and exhibiting at the Salon d'Automne in 1911. This sojourn would have overlapped with Group of Seven member A.Y. Jackson, who was also in France at this time. This painting, Autumn in France, from the National Gallery of Canada collection, dates to 1911, so of this period. When Carr returned to Canada in 1912, she brought the bold colors of post-impressionism and fauvism to a West Coast audience for the first time. Both before and after her European travels, Carr had found inspiration from a trip to Alaska, admiring the crest poles at Sitka in 1908, and she renewed her interest following her return from France. She embarked on a project that she described as documenting the Indigenous village sites in British Columbia. She visited the islands of the northwest coast of British Columbia, including Haida Gwaii and the Upper Skeena River. Here we're looking at the village of Gitsagukla in the Skeena River Valley, today home to more than 500 members of the Gitskan First Nation. And this painting is in the collection of the Art Gallery of Vancouver Art Gallery. In contrast to later work such as our Indian Barn, Carr's work from this period of 1912 to 13 shows a living Indigenous culture, with people present in the villages, present alongside the longhouses and totem poles. Today, we would describe the impulse to document Indigenous cultures as an exercise of salvage, to document Indigenous cultures before they disappear. But her work was not well received, and her expressive interpretation of the poles and monumental sculptures was not considered accurate enough or documentary in the way preferred for anthropological research and study. It was therefore deemed not suitable for the Provincial Museum. Carr's proposal to donate a large body of work to the Natural History Museum in Victoria was rejected. This rejection of her vision led Carr to more or less abandon painting for the next 13 years. She supported herself by running a boarding house and also made pottery and rugs for sale to tourists, appropriating Indigenous motifs in her work. Brought to the attention of Eric Brown from the National Gallery by ethnologist Marius Barbeau of the National Museum, now the Canadian Museum of History, Carr's work was included in the important Exhibition of Canadian West Coast Art, Native and Modern, shown in Ottawa, Montreal, and Toronto in 1927. And here we're looking at an installation view of the exhibition with Carr's paintings combined with Indigenous carvings by anonymous or unnamed producers. Carr traveled east for the exhibition and met her contemporaries, members of the Group of Seven, for the first time. Although as a woman, Carr was not eligible for membership in the group, her work and ideas were welcomed and embraced and encouraged by these artists. The discovery of Carr, working on the West Coast, supported the idea of a national school, what was largely a regional school of landscape painting aspiring to national scope. Following this important exhibition and the contact and encouragement with other artists in Central Canada and approaching her 60th birthday, Carr entered her mature period, a period of intense productivity. Our work, completed in 1929, dates to this mature period. Friendly Cove is the settler name for Yukwat on Nootka Island in Nootka Sound, just west of Vancouver Island. It was the summer home of the Nucholnath people for generations, and Mwachalant territory today. In pre-contact times, the settlement housed approximately 1,500 people in some 20 traditional wooden longhouses. By the first part of the 20th century, however, this number had been reduced significantly by death and disease. In 1966, the federal government moved the last of the community to a reserve at Gold River, British Columbia. In this watercolor, the scene is deserted, and the only reference to the inhabitants of Yukwat is in the title, Indian Barn. The title also suggesting it is a structure made by and for use for the Indigenous community. The fate of the community is suggested by the crosses of the Christian graveyard in the foreground, the absence of people in the landscape, reinforcing the belief that Native peoples in Canada were in decline and would ultimately disappear. Official government policy at the time this watercolor was produced. Indian Barn is thought to be one of several that Carr produced following a 1929 visit to Nootka. And here we're looking at a contemporary photograph of part of the island. According to Carr biographer Maria Tippett, Carr traveled by train up the east coast of Vancouver Island in May of 1929, then traveled by steamer 40 miles down the Alberni Inlet and the Trevor Channel to the Pacific, and there another 95 miles north to Nootka on the west coast. Carr then hiked to the entrance of Friendly Cove, where she sketched Bert Fish's lighthouse and Captain Jack's house, according to her journal notes. One of the other works completed following this trip to Uquat is this work, Church at Uquat Village, from 1929, in the collection of the AGO. Previously titled Indian Church, the painting was renamed in 2018. Like many institutions, the AGO has replaced terminology from colonial perspective and beginning a process of reconciliation and redress. The change is not without controversy. Some view this as an attempt to whitewash the past, to deny Canada's colonial history and a history of racism. Some Indigenous people still self-identify as Indian for reasons that are both personal and legal. But the word obscures the great diversity of Indigenous peoples, the diversity of nations and cultures in the Americas, and carries a painful legacy. We have a similar problem with the title of our own Watercolor, a title even more charged because the structure is identified as Indian barn. A barn is a place for livestock, for machinery and equipment, possibly for storing food. It seems more likely that the structure is a longhouse, in other words, a traditional type of home for Indigenous peoples common on the West Coast and elsewhere. A subsequent work, perhaps taken from the watercolor, has a different title, West Coast Indian Cemetery by Forest Edge, an oil on canvas. In her work, Carr grappled with ideas of spirituality found in nature, in the landscape of her home province. Her ideas were shaped by her middle-class Protestant background and her reading of philosophy, theosophy, Hinduism, and transcendentalism. She expressed these ideas formally through the language of modernism. She also shared attitudes to Indigenous peoples and cultures that were predominant at that time. Carr died in 1945, leaving a significant body of work, both in number and accomplishment. As I mentioned, our watercolor was purchased in 1953, but Sam Weir had been making inquiries about possible acquisitions for a few years, and he was interested in acquiring an oil by the artist as well. He described his reasons to Ira Dilworth, a friend of the artist, in a letter. I wish to have a rounded collection of Canadian art. I imagine it will find its way in complete form to an art gallery or museum when I'm gone. The work of Emily Carr is, of course, important, but I am of the view that in time the furor she has created will subside. There has never been a great woman painter, end quote. And Sam Weir took the trouble to underline the word great. Weir's opinion of Carr had not improved by the early 60s, when he wrote to Henry Hill of Berry Hill Galleries in New York City. And quoting, I think she was quite irrational in her work for some years. However, that is the present taste. If you uncover anything, let me know. As you know, I am making a Canadian collection, regardless of whether I like all the items or not, end quote. I suppose we can assume that Carr was not one of the artists that Sam Weir admired, but he recognized the importance of including her work in his collection, and for that we are grateful. Today, the words of art historian Lisa Baldessari, writing in her book on Carr, published by the Art Canada Institute, emphasize Carr's accomplishments and lasting significance. She writes, Carr was one of the very few women artists in this period who rejected the pastoral landscapes, domestic scenes, and portraits of mothers and children to seek out subjects with challenging political and ecological themes and cultural significance, end quote. And so we celebrate this pioneering female artist as we come to the end of Women's History Month. Thank you for watching, and stay tuned for our next installment of Weir Wednesdays.